One of the most influential forces in music history and the best-selling band of all time that launched the Fab Four into global superstardom. The Beatles were bigger than Jesus, traveling the world to sell out shows to meet unprecedented demand. But their tours weren't without controversy. In 1966, at the height of Beatlemania, the population of the Philippines was so angered by their behavior that they wanted them out of the country immediately. After a huge diplomatic mistake, the band was put in real physical danger and had to race to the airport to escape. So, what did the Beatles do to anger an entire nation? And what was it that made them decide to stop touring? Welcome to Behind the Music. In today's video, we dive into the unbelievable story of the Beatles' trip to the Philippines in 1966 and how they almost never made it out alive.
Well, he tried to kill us, President Marcus.
Yes, but you want to review that?
Yeah, well, we went to Manila back in the 60s.
The Beatles have their origins in Liverpool, where a teenage John Lennon met Paul McCartney and George Harrison. By 1960, they had found their way to Germany, playing in Hamburg regularly. At the time, many record labels believed that the fading rock and roll of the likes of Elvis Presley signaled the shift away from electric guitars and the genre. But the Beatles were about to be the first band to open the gates for a golden age of rock and roll. Their chance came after employing Brian Epstein as their manager, who helped them get signed to EMI's Parlophone label. When their first single, Love Me Do, was released, it was an immediate hit, leading to television spots and international fame. What followed was hit after hit, as the creative masterminds John Lennon and Paul McCartney found in each other perfect artistic partners. Their first studio album was released in 1963, entitled Please, Please Me, which included I Saw Her Standing There, P.S. I Love You, along with 12 other tracks. The album's title song, Please, Please Me, was released as a single, which proved to be enough to catapult the group to global fame. This set off a marathon of tours as Beatlemania swept the nation through Europe and even penetrated the American market, appearing on The Ed Sullivan Show where an estimated 73 million viewers tuned in, a record in American television history. Success only snowballed into more success, and the Beatles transformed into an important British export. The Queen bestowed them with the Order of the British Empire. However, this honor ended up being more of a curse than a blessing, eventually making the Beatles the target of public demonstrations, political campaigns, and even violence. In 1966, when the Beatles' global stock was reaching its peak, the band set out to three tumultuous regions: West Germany, Japan, and the Philippines. In West Germany, it was already clear that the Beatles were growing tired of media attention. Press conferences became a tense and frustrating chore for the band, while their performances on stage did not stand to impress some critics. In Japan, the price for hosting the Beatles was almost equivalent to $1 million per night in today's terms. Huge security measures were implemented to protect the band from potential extremist opponents. The band was confined to a Tokyo hotel room for almost the entirety of their stay. Military forces were tasked with guarding the band. This was taken to an entirely new level in the Philippines. From the moment they arrived, it was chaos. They had a brutal introduction to the conditions that President Ferdinand Marcos had created for the country. His wife, Imelda Marcos, a musician herself, had been instrumental in his election just a year earlier. All these facts would become painfully clear to the Beatles, but all too late. On arrival, they were shoved into a car and for the first time cut off from their management. George Harrison later said that there was a negative vibe from the moment the band got off the plane, something they had not experienced on tour before. Then they were ordered into a car by plainclothed officers and taken to the Navy headquarters for a press conference. As was true with earlier stops on the tour, the Beatles gave short and unserious responses to many of the journalists' softball questions. Manila Harbor, where they were taken onto the yacht of a man named Don Manalo Elizalde, a wealthy businessman. This was set to be their accommodation for their time in the Philippines, and according to one account, the band members were taken into a hot, sweaty room filled with police officers. It was too much for their manager, Brian Epstein, who demanded a real hotel. However, this would end up leaving them more vulnerable and almost universally hated in the country. Their attendance was an act of diplomacy, and the British Embassy had been working closely with the tour operators to ensure that everything went smoothly. That's why when the Beatles failed to show up at the Malacanang Palace and First Lady of the Philippines, it was a big deal. Later, the management team argued over whose blame it was. At the time, The group found out the hard way on the evening news. A lavish evening had been prepared at the palace. Their event was broadcast live on television, leading to the nation reacting with disgust when it became clear that the Beatles were not arriving. A wave of headlines describing the incident as a snub to the First Lady. It was an insult to an entire people. A spokesman for the palace even claimed that the Beatles had spat in the eye of the first family with their rejection. In between their two shows that evening, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. From their hotel, the Beatles watched on television as the First Lady condemned their behavior. Brian Epstein, along with their publicity manager Tony Barrow, arranged for a statement to be read later that night. Though strangely, the audio recording they made for the occasion was lost. As far as most Filipinos were concerned, the Beatles had humiliated their leaders and made no apologies. After their evening show, the band's car was mobbed by the public. This time, they weren't friendly. They shook the limousines while the band members sat inside, terrified. There was no longer a security detail for them to rely on. Fingers were pointed at Brian Epstein for blame. Things were spiraling out of control. The following day, they discovered that security had been pulled from their hotel too. Given their worldwide fame, the rest of the tour involved the highest levels of security possible. Without any protection at all and in a hostile country, this put the Beatles at high risk. Their flight was scheduled for 3:30 p.m. However, after an $80,000 tax bill had been delivered to the hotel earlier that day, the Beatles were warned that they would not be allowed to leave until they paid up. Brian Epstein called to speak to the pilot of their scheduled flight directly to make sure it wouldn't leave them stranded. The pilot told Epstein that he would delay as long as possible, but there were no guarantees. The race was on to get them out of the country. Arriving at the terminal, it was surrounded by soldiers, weaponry, and police, alongside angry protesters. Anything that would assist them, from escalators to elevators, had been turned off, but it didn't stop there. Brian Epstein was kicked and punched in the face as he helped to escort the band through a hostile crowd in the terminal. By the time they eventually reached the plane, he was bleeding. Just as the plane was about to depart, the management team was pulled off the plane. Thankfully, though, after an interrogation, he was released. At last, the Beatles escaped their nightmare in the Philippines. So traumatized were the Beatles after their 1966 tour that they soon stopped touring entirely. They played just over a dozen more live shows before retreating almost exclusively to the studio. George Harrison said later that the only reason he would ever return to the Philippines would be to drop a dirty big bomb on it. But the Philippines wasn't the entire reason for putting a halt to tours. That year had been a tumultuous time for many reasons. They had been performing virtually nonstop. In 1963 alone, they played 208 gigs. They were also tired of the excessive security, not being able to hear themselves in concerts, and constant media attention, which, just as in the Philippines, made them a target. In the United States, John Lennon's inflammatory remarks about Christianity caused backlash from the religious community. Lennon claimed that the band was more popular than Jesus and was accused of having a God complex. The extraordinary popularity of the group no doubt contributed to this. On tour, the separation between the band and the real world was taking its toll. For a group of Liverpool lads, it was another reason to quit touring for good. Their concert at San Francisco's Candlestick Park signaled the end of the Beatlemania that had gripped popular culture. The band split up 4 years later, spending the remainder of their time in the studio, where they produced some of their best music. That's it for this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more in-depth videos that go behind the music. We'll talk to you again in the next one.